Now, let's say that Twitter was, now it turns out Jack Dorsey actually wanted to keep Donald Trump on and his team didn't. And there was long conversations, and Jack has written about this, and he was ultimately convinced that this was the right thing for Twitter to do. But let's assume that what happened was that Jack Dorsey got a call from the Biden transition team, and they said, look, you want to be on our good side going forward, kick him off. Who would you blame under those circumstances? Would you call it censorship if that was the circumstances?
Yes, if there's really threats involved, and often like you'll be on our good side, but if you don't do it, you'll be on our bad side. Yes. And if it really means we're going to pass bogus laws against you, or we're going to use antitrust against you, if that's really, even if it's not voiced, but it's clear that's the implication, then yes, I think it's certainly akin to censorship. It's that the government, it's sort of, you can think of it as indirect censorship or censorship by proxy. It's getting Twitter to do something so it nominally looks like this is a private company making a private decision, but it's not. It's the government making that this content's beyond the pale, and so we don't want it, or we don't want it this prominent, and that is akin to censorship. And part of the whole, when you have a mixed economy like this, and you have that in some context it's thought of, yeah, I mean, antitrust is a proper power and it's got to be able to control really big companies. You get this kind of intertwining where from an outside perspective, you don't know what's happening. And I actually think in many cases inside the company, they don't know why they've made this. They don't know, was it because there's threats of the government? Like, and how much did that influence our decision? Would we, and sometimes they'll think, yeah, I mean, there were threats, but we would have done this anyways. But is it really true that they would have done it anyway if those threats weren't there? And so, and it's very hard to make that determination. And it's easy to fool yourself because you don't like to think that you're operating under threats. Like the reason we made this decision is because we were being threatened. So there is such a thing as sort of after the fact of telling yourself, no, this was I'm still in control. This was my decision. So when that's not actually true. And if government wasn't there making these kinds of threats, this wouldn't have happened. But they then tell themselves, oh yeah, this is, so like what actually went on with Dorsey, that does he think in the end this was the right decision? Or was it sort of partly it's my employees that convinced me, but partly I know there's these threats on, and it's some combination of all that resulted in his decision.
And who do you blame there? I mean, going back to, because everybody blamed Dorsey and blamed Twitter, but what's the origin of the threat of the issue?
Yeah,
and it's government. It's not
clearly got, and it's. I put a lot of blame on the people that when government's doing this in a way they like, they don't say anything.
Yep.
And then when it's now this kind of government threats is operating in a way like our content's going down, not somebody else's content, then it's a big deal. And it's, oh, this is violation of freedom of speech. But I mean, this is a point Ayn Rand made. I mean, it's a slightly different point, but it's the same, in the same vein, that if you take rights seriously, you have to defend them even when the people who are exercising their rights you disagree with, you find unattractive, you think what they're doing is wrong, even evil. So, I mean, she wrote about censorship in the 70s and the Supreme Court allowing certain decisions against obscenity and so on. And she went out of her way to say, look, I'm not a fan of hardcore pornography, but rights are absolutes. And the government will always target people who are sort of marginalized in one way or another, so that the majority say, like, what's the big deal? You're stopping hardcore porn. And then when the government expands its powers or uses it in some other way, then they cry bloody murder. Yep. And you have to, when it first happens, you have to see it for what it is, and you have to be outraged. Like when I saw the these tech people being dragged in front of Congress. Like, if anything, it should be the reverse. It should be Congress dragged in front of the tech people and them asking them, like, what the hell are you doing in running this country? But to see it the reverse, and that you're not outraged, and it doesn't matter if you think that you don't like, they took down somebody that you liked and deplatformed them. And so that's so irrelevant when it's now government wielding power over entities like this.
And where were all these people when Donald Trump was threatening Jeff Bezos because of the Washington Post, or threatening just the media generally and wanting to change the defamation laws and stuff like that? Just the threats.
Yeah.
None of these people attacked Trump for that. They defended Trump for that. So if you support government involvement in these kind of issues, then you're going to suffer the consequences. Often this will be used against your point of view, and don't complain when it is. All right, let's see. People might not know this, but this issue of kind of censorship by proxy is not new. Do you remember the Hollywood standards that from the 1930s on?
Yeah,
there was a committee in Hollywood that basically would decide what scenes needed to be cut, and mostly it was about sex. But and how you need to be dressed. And for example, in the 50s, if you watch movies from the 50s, you'll note that married people, there's never a double bed. Yeah. They always sleep in separate beds, and that's what they called the censorship. It was a committee, and it was a private entity that kind of governed Hollywood. But it was two things interesting about that. One is the excuse they used was, if we don't do it, government will. Yeah, which is whether that's true or not is questionable, because whether the Supreme Court would have upheld it. But the second issue that that raises is, where's antitrust laws? In a sense that this is collusion, right? All the studios working on one, so the government was in collusion, if only by not applying the antitrust laws to that, right?
I mean, that's part of what's non-objective about the antitrust laws, is that it allows like, when stuff's happening that they agree with, okay, we'll let the companies function and do it. And when,
for example,
yeah. So it is, and this is why a company never knows, like, is antitrust going to descend on us? It depends if the government's unhappy with what you're doing.
Yeah. It's really interesting. The movies from the 20s and early 30s are racier.
Oh yeah, way racier.
Way racier than movies in the 40s, 50s, and even beginning of the 60s. And then the system breaks down in like the mid 60s. But it's really fascinating, that history. And that was censorship by proxy. So when you look at all these tech companies, Twitter not only dropping, deplatforming Trump, but deplatforming a lot of people, Alex Jones originally, and then more recently anybody involved, I think, with the January 6th attack. You've got Facebook limiting people, and there's some evidence, although the more I read about it, the shakier the evidence gets, that all of these platforms are biased against conservatives, that they tend to deplatform conservatives more than they. What needs to be done? Right? What should be the response?
So I think one is to look more broadly at the universe. So what would you say about Fox News and who they have on and don't have on? And it's the biggest cable news network. I don't know for how long it's been the #1 rated network, but it's, many years now. And they put way more, whatever, conservative, allegedly right-leaning people on, and they give them a platform and they give them a voice and they amplify that voice. And it's like, if you think in comparison MSNBC, it has much less impact and influence. And it is the issue that government should go in and sort of be egalitarian and try to reduce all this to everybody's exactly the same. And so there's in some areas of the media landscape, the conservatives are in control, and they prioritize their content. And it is true that Silicon Valley leans Democrat, however you want to put it, liberal, left. And so that there's going to be, when they're thinking about content that we find objectionable beyond the pale, that there might be a slant in a certain political direction. Yeah, there might be. And part of the issue is this is what competition looks like.
Yeah, I always say if conservatives are so worried about it, they should start companies and be more entrepreneurial. Because
and the thing is, they have in some areas, like Fox News is number one, and it is. I don't think Fox News should be broken up for antitrust and split into 4 different networks so MSNBC can compete more. And so, no, that shouldn't happen. It shouldn't happen to Facebook. It shouldn't happen to Twitter.
And people they have no sense of history. I mean, I keep reminding people that in 1980, when Ronald Reagan was running for president, there were 3 networks, all of them on the left politically, all of them pro-democratic. You can't argue that those networks were unbiased. And Ayn Rand wrote about this in terms of their bias, that all the major newspapers were tilted democratic. None of them, I don't think any of them, maybe Wall Street Journal, endorsed Ronald Reagan for president. There was no talk radio. Talk radio had not really been invented at that point. There was no internet. There was no alternative media. All the media was pro-democratic. And yet Ronald Reagan still won. And if you compare it to today, we have thousands of media outlets. The most bizarre right-wing nonsense, conspiracy theory, crazy stuff, the most bizarre left-wing communist crazy stuff, and everything in between. You have much more selection today. You have much more available to you today than you had, 40 years ago.
And if you think in particular, so you brought up Reagan, and if you put Trump, there's a real argument that Trump couldn't have been elected without social media. Mm-hmm. And so to put it that they're somehow have it in for Trump, and look at how they're destroying. He wouldn't be president if not for Facebook and Twitter. Yep. And even his reelection, that if he didn't have Twitter as a platform of the whole time he's president, his reelection would have been, I think he would have got fewer votes than what he got. So the idea, look at how these people have screwed Trump.
Yep. It's bizarre. So a lot of these platforms are under what's called Section 230 of the Telecommunications Act of 1994 or 6. I always get those mixed up. I think it's 6, which was a big re-regulation of the telecom industry. It's a massive bill. It deregulates in some areas and increased regulations in others, but it's a huge mishmash. Generally, probably more on the side of freedom than not.
Yeah.
Broadly speaking. But part of that was this Section 230 that now is infamous. So is government through Section 230 giving something to internet companies that is not theirs? Are they giving them some kind of privileges that they should not have?
Yeah, I think that's a dangerous way to think about it. And it is now common to say that government gave you this privilege that you are immune from certain kinds of lawsuits, and we could take it away. So it's a kind of threat that we gave you this, and we could take it away if you don't do content moderation in the way we think you should be doing it. And you might think and argue that there's problems with the law, but the basic, if you step one step back, what government does and what it should be doing in these kinds of cases is to think about how liability should work in a context of people's individual rights. So should it be, and let's take something sort of smaller than Facebook, Twitter, the New York Times, they put up stories and op-eds and editorials from their editorial board, and they have a comment section. And the comment section is open to people. Should the New York Times be liable for every comment made? And this is an issue of not are we granting them some privilege, but thinking from the perspective of individual rights. Should they be liable for every comment that someone posts? And I think the answer to that is no. It's you're not it's not to say nobody's liable. It's to say the person making the comment, if they've or they post something that's a violation of copyright, or they libel somebody, that the poster is, if somebody went after them, you could have a lawsuit against them. You can't against the company that's just opened up comments for people, and they don't know what people are posting and so on. And that's not, you've granted them some New York Times, some privilege. And so you're recognizing the scope of their rights and the scope of other people's rights. Like the person who posted is responsible for the content, including if the content is in some way illegal.
So does that change if the New York Times decides certain comments are so out of line that they're going to delete them?
No, I mean, I mean, this is part of what Section 230, from what I've read about some of the legislators who originated this and wanted this passed, and so this was the kind of worry, and there was some court and conflicting court decisions where some were kind of implying that if you exercise any editorial content, kind of editorial control over the content, then you're liable for everything. But just, I mean, take a simple example. The New York Times, they have a comment section, and someone points out, you know, this comment is a violation of copyright. They posted a whole story from the LA Times that's copyrighted. And if the New York Times takes it down, it doesn't somehow now make them liable for every comment that's been made on the site. Like, why would it make them liable?
Yeah, absolutely. It amazes me that people are making these arguments as if you take down a comment, you become a publisher, as if that's a category that is not clearly defined.
Yeah, but even when you think about publishers, the issue of liability is not obvious. So there's a kind of, if you think of how the argument's working, it's sort of, there's this background assumption, which is completely wrong, but the background assumption that you're liable for everything unless the government gives you a privilege to say, oh no, you're not liable for this or you're not liable for that. But liability is not, it's not created by government. So it's a part of thinking about rights and the exercise of rights and what you're responsible for, and therefore liable for if you've somehow engaged in misconduct in the area of your responsibility. So even if the New York Times is, so you can think of it as a publisher and they exercise editorial control, are they liable for, they have a guest op-ed, are they liable for every aspect of what is produced, even though they exercise some editorial control? And it's not obvious to me. The answer is yes. It might be like for their reporters and so on, there's some degree of like a higher degree of liability. But if they take an op-ed of mine and it turns out I plagiarized half of it, and they do some editorial control, but they can't, I mean, you can't, any teacher will tell you, you can't find every instance of plagiarism. And then someone points out, look, this was like what they said about Melania Trump, that she lifted half her speech from Obama, I mean, Obama's wife, that it's, yeah, we didn't realize that, and now we'll take it down when you point out this is like, are they liable for it? It's, so you have to think, if you're really thinking about individual rights, you have to think, what are people liable for? And then what should the law be? Mm-hmm. But it's not some government gives everybody these privileges, or you're not liable for that, and you're not, it's, no, you have to think rationally about how liability should work.
It's truly stunning how shallow and simplistic people's thinking is about these topics. That's what scares me more than anything else, more than what the government is doing or more than what Twitter and Facebook is doing, is how shallow people's thinking is and understanding of these issues in a significant number of people.
What we need today, what I call the new intellectual, would be any man or woman who is willing to think, meaning any man or woman who knows that man's life must be guided by reason, by the intellect, not by feelings, wishes, whims, or mystic revelations. Any man or woman who values his life and who does not want to give in to today's cult of despair, cynicism, and impotence, and does not intend to give up the world to the dark ages and to the rule of the collectivist brute.
All right, before we go on, reminder, please like the show. We've got 163 live listeners right now, 30 likes. That should be at least 100. I figure at least 100 of you actually like the show. Maybe there are like 60 of the Matthews out there who hate it, but at least the people who are liking it, you know, I want to see a thumbs up. There you go. Start liking it. I want to see that go to 100. All it takes is a click of a thing, whether you're looking at this. And you know, the likes matter. It's not an issue of my ego. It's an issue of the algorithm. The more you like something, the more the algorithm likes it. So, you know, and if you don't like the show, give it a thumbs down. Let's see your actual views being reflected in the likes. But if you like it, don't just sit there. Help get the show promoted. Of course, you should also share. And you can support the show at JeronBrookShow.com/support, or on Patreon or Subscribestar or Locals, and show your support for the work, for the value hopefully you're receiving from this. And of course, don't forget, if you're not a subscriber, even if you just come here to troll, or even if you're here like Matthew to defend Marx, then you should subscribe, because that way you'll know when to show up. You'll know what shows are on, when they're on. You'll get notified, right? So, yes, like, share, subscribe, support. Like, share, subscribe, support. There you go. Easy. Do one or all of those, please.